Hello, everyone that's joining us today. We are live from Cooperstown. For those of you who are regular attendees to our virtual programming series, things might look a little bit different today. My name is Leah Buhagiar. I am the Manager of Educational Programming here at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown. And our usual host for these events, Mr. Bruce Markusen, he is actually going to be our guest. For those of you who do not know, Bruce is actually a published author. And we're going to be focusing today on his book, Roberto Clemente, the Great One. It was released a few years back, and we're going to talk a little bit to Bruce today about his interest in Clemente, where that came from, and about the life and legacy of Clemente himself. Bruce, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. This feels a little bit weird to be on this side, but I think it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it.
I think so too. I'm really excited. I know your passion for Roberto Clemente and for the things that you've written in the past always come through in conversations that we have. So I'm really excited to chat a little bit about this today. Now, just as we typically do, we're going to take questions from our audience. So if you do have anything that you'd like to ask Bruce throughout the program, please feel free to put it in the chat box here on Zoom, and we'll do our best to moderate that and ask questions throughout the program. So don't hesitate to let us know anything you might be thinking. Bruce, are you ready to get started?
Absolutely.
Great. So one of the reasons that we're doing this program is because it is still currently Hispanic Heritage Month. Every year from September 15th through October 15th, we really focus on Hispanic heritage, especially in the game of baseball here at the Hall of Fame. And it's an especially significant year because just a few weeks ago, it was actually the 50th anniversary of Roberto Clemente's 3,000th and final regular season hit. So that's what was sort of our inspiration for finally turning the tables on Bruce and having him be a guest with us today. So Bruce, I really want to start off by talking to you about why Clemente. What is it that really got you interested in Roberto Clemente? Because for those of you who aren't aware, Bruce did not grow up in Pittsburgh and he did not grow up as a Pirates fan. So what was it about Clemente that really interested you as a kid?
Well, that's right, Leah. I grew up as a Yankee fan. I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. But Roberto Clemente was one of the players that really interested me from a young age. Because of my heritage. I'm not sure how many people realize that my mother was Puerto Rican. My mother, Ana Graciela Rodriguez Markusen, was born in Santurce. And I found this out many years later, but Santurce, where my mother was born, was actually the first professional team that Roberto Clemente played for. So I had this common link in terms of Latino heritage, even though my name does not sound Latino in any way. And I obviously look very different from a Roberto Clemente. But we did have this heritage. And growing up, my sister and I were told that, when we had relatives on my mother's side come over to the house, we had to speak Spanish with them. We had to at least give it an attempt, even though we were obviously much more comfortable in English. My sister became really good at Spanish. I was never quite as skilled, but I could carry on basic conversations in the Spanish language. So because of this commonality with Puerto Rico, Clemente became my favorite player at a very young age. He, of course, died when I was extremely young. I was only 7 years of age. I'd really just started following the game. And I have only very scant memories of hearing about his death on the news that evening. Of course, he was killed in a plane crash, New Year's Eve, 1972. The news would have come very late at night. I probably would have heard about it the next day on newscasts. So I don't have very vivid memories of that, but I do remember that it had a tremendous impact on baseball fans like myself, and certainly all Pirate fans, and certainly fans in Clemente's native Puerto Rico. So it really started with that. And even after he passed away, I maintained the interest. I watched a lot of video of him. I read books about him. I became motivated to write my own book back in 1998. And he remains a fascinating figure to this day. He was such on the field, such an exciting, dynamic player. I don't think I've seen an outfielder with as strong a throwing arm as Roberto Clemente. he had this energetic way of running the bases, the way he pumped his arms. He was always going all out all the time. And he was an incredibly exciting offensive player. He could hit pitches, 2 inches off the ground or seemingly, a foot above chest level and still hit them hard. He was a great bad ball hitter. He just was so exciting on the field. And then as I learned more about him and learned about all of the different things he was involved in off the field, charitable efforts, trying to help poor people, trying to help the underprivileged, really became a heroic figure to me and remains so to this day, even though it's now 50 years since we lost him.
Thanks so much for that, Bruce. I'm wondering, I know he was relatively young when you passed away and you didn't live in Pittsburgh. Did you ever get to see him play or on television? Did you listen to games that Roberto Clemente played in on the radio? What was your exposure to him when he was playing?
Yeah, Leah, the memories I have of him mostly were watching Mets games when the Mets played the Pirates, because I grew up in Westchester County outside of New York. And the Mets at that time probably broadcast anywhere from 70 to 90 of their games on WOR television, Channel 9 in New York. And it was a local station, and anybody that had basic television, this was the days before cable, anybody who had a basic TV set could watch those games. So whenever the Mets played the Pirates, I would watch them. Occasionally, the Pirates would be on national television games on NBC. I think I may have gone to a game at Shea Stadium where the Mets played the Pirates. My father was a Mets fan, and he took me to Shea Stadium regularly. And I do have some vague memories of seeing the Mets hosting the Pirates, but I'm not 100% sure just because it's all these years later. But definitely saw him on television, both in terms of the WOR broadcasts and the national broadcasts. And he was one of those guys that once you saw him play, it was hard to take your eyes off him.
Absolutely. I know I never had the chance to see Clemente play live, but the highlights that you see of him even today are really incredible and seems like such a dynamic player. Another thing I'm sure a lot of other baseball fans can relate to is your love of card collecting from a young age and the significance of some of Roberto Clemente's baseball cards in particular. So I know when we've chatted a little bit about Clemente's life and his legacy, noting the different ways that the media portrayed him and talked about him, you'll notice in the early card here, the 1958 Topps refers to him as Bob Clemente, and then the different dynamics that went along with that. So you just talk a little bit about your card collecting and how that got you really immersed in the game as well.
Well, card collecting is something I definitely remember vividly. My first year of collecting cards was 1972. And you see that classic shot of Clemente was taken at Shea Stadium sometime probably in the 1971 season. It's hard to see on the photo, but he's actually flipping a ball in midair. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was a stage thing or he just happened to be doing it and the photographer caught him. But it's just a great shot of him. He's not even looking at the cameraman. He's looking at the ball halfway in midair and he's about to catch it. Just a very cool photograph of Clemente in that classic Pirates uniform. And I remember collecting his cards from 72. There was not only this card, but there was an in-action shot. And there was also a couple of World Series cards that he appeared on because the Pirates had been in the 1971 World Series. And then I definitely remember as well his 1973 Topps card, which did come out posthumously. He had passed away in that plane crash on New Year's Eve. Topps had already made a card for him. They decided to go ahead and include it in their packs of cards early in 73. And I remember getting that card and it did feel kind of surreal. Here was my favorite player and I had a card of him, but he was gone. He was not going to play, obviously. He'd been taken from us at the age of 38. And this card really kind of struck me because it was an action shot. And at the time, action photos were kind of new on baseball cards. And I just love this shot. It's a spring training game. It's the Pirates against the Mets. That's Jerry Grody, the catcher. And you can see Clemente is sort of getting ready as the pitch is coming in. You can see the umpire is peering over Jerry Grody's shoulder. It's a wonderful photograph of him in action, albeit in a spring training game. So I have tremendous memories of collecting these early cards and wanting to get as many of them as I could. It wasn't enough to have one Clemente card from each season. You had to have every one of the cards that he appeared on, and you had to have multiple ones, because if I damaged one, I wanted to have a backup. So that's the way I approached it. And of course, on these cards, he appeared with his actual name, Roberto, which he was very proud of. And it was something that he wanted people to call him. But earlier in his career, a lot of people did not call him that. Writers called him Bob or Bobby or Robbie. He really didn't like that. He felt that this was sort of taking away from his Latino heritage. I don't think people necessarily meant anything bad by it, but maybe subconsciously people were trying to Americanize him, trying to make him more like an American English-speaking player. And it was reflected also in those early Topps baseball cards. And again, I don't think Topps meant this in a bad way. I don't think there was any ill will. They just didn't know. They didn't understand that this was something offensive to the player, not the way that he wanted to be represented. And when people called him Bob, he would correct them on that. Now, the only person he made an exception for was his good friend, the legendary Pirate broadcaster, Bob Prince. And Bob would often, when he was talking to Roberto, he would often call him Bobby or Robbie. Clemente let that slide because they were friends. They knew each other, and he kind of made an exception for Bob Prince. But with other people who didn't know him as well, he would correct them. He would tell them, hey, my name is Roberto. That is, the way I prefer to be addressed, and certainly understandable that he would take that approach. But he was so proud of his Puerto Rican heritage. He was proud of his name, and of course, we all have names we want to be called by. I had nicknames in school that I didn't particularly like, and sometimes I told the other kids I didn't like them. Well, this, I guess, was something similar that went on with Roberto, and he did try to correct these folks as much as he could.
Yeah, it's really brave of him to have done that. And considering he probably didn't speak much English when he first started playing for the Pirates either. So pretty significant that he really stood his ground and made sure that he was called by his given name. And thinking about it now, if somebody talked to me about Bob Clemente, I'd probably have to ask them who they meant. Like Roberto Clemente is such a significant name in the game of baseball. So
I think, Leah, I think there were some other players who also were called names that they didn't like. A common thing for Latino players of the 50s and 60s was to call them Chico, which means little boy. And I'm sure these players didn't like that. A lot of them maybe didn't feel they had the stature in the game, like a Roberto Clemente. They didn't feel like they could say anything. One thing Major League Baseball does every year now, they send out a list to all the media, the names of all the players on the opening day rosters. And they tell, in this list, they tell the writers and the broadcasters, this is the name the player wants to be called, and they have a pronunciation guide. Well, that never happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So the player didn't really have any say. You were called what you were called. And if a broadcaster on TV called you Bob or Bobby, there wasn't much Roberto could do. Mm-hmm. But when he was called that in a face-to-face conversation, it was a little bit of a different story. But he was one of the few guys who felt, they kind of know who I am. I have a little bit of credibility in this game. And he was willing to speak out and try to get people to call him the right name.
Absolutely. One thing I thought was really interesting as well when I was putting this PowerPoint together and looking at some of the really awesome Roberto Clemente cards throughout the year, one of the first search results was his 2022 Topps card. It looks like Topps actually released him as a legacy card in this past set as well, which I think really just speaks to the legacy of Clemente and how much he still means to the game of baseball. Like you said, 50 years after his death. So I'm gonna.
I hadn't seen this card before you put it up, and it's a picture from Roberto early in his career, and
he looks very young.
Me is he's wearing a helmet even though he's in a fielding position. Now, it's probably a pregame picture. It is a pregame picture. But this is back in the mid-50s when the Pirates actually wore helmets in the field, which they did for a few years. So that's kind of what came to mind when I saw that photo.
Yeah, I didn't know that they wore helmets. That's really interesting. Was it for safety concerns, or was it more for the look? Do you know?
Yeah, I think it was for safety concerns. I want to say this was maybe when Branch Rickey was involved in the franchise, and the Pirates had all of their players, I believe, including their pitchers, wear helmets in the field. And it went on for at least a couple years. But then eventually they kind of went back to the traditional, just wearing the cap when you're at your defensive position. And of course, at the plate, most teams, well, all other teams, they did not mandate that their players wear helmets. But for a while, the Pirates did. It didn't really become a major league rule, though, until the early 1970s that all players, except those who had been grandfathered in, would have to wear the helmets at the plate. But yeah, with this photograph, this shows us that, yeah, the Pirate players actually wore helmets in the field as well. Kind of unusual.
Yeah, very interesting. So I wanted to go back to something that you had mentioned a little earlier, that 1971 World Series. It's really a significant point in Clemente's career, but it wasn't actually the first World Series that he played in, and it was not the first World Series that he won. So what is the significance of this 1971 series versus that 1960 World Series that he played in as a young Pirates player?
Well, the 1960 series, he, I think, batted over 300. He handled all of his chances in the field flawlessly. And the Pirates ended up upsetting the New York Yankees 7 games. But there were other Pirate players who had better series. And of course, Bill Mazeroski ends up winning it with a game-ending home run in Game 7. So Clemente's performance really got overlooked. 1971, he was the dominant player. Also, you had a situation where Game 4 is the first night game in World Series history. Prior to then, every World Series game ever played had started in the afternoon and in the daylight. Game 4, 71 series started night, prime time, and it aired on NBC television, which had the series at that time. And it drew incredible numbers. 63 million people watched that game on NBC. At the time, that was a record for a prime time sporting event. So that was a huge number. 63 million is huge today, but back then it was an incredible number. And of course, all the other games were on TV as well, although they were afternoon games. But the series was compelling. It was hotly contested, close games. It went down to a very tense, close Game 7, 2-1, the Pirates won. So a lot of people watched the series, and they saw Clemente, who had been a great player for years. I mean, he'd been doing these kinds of things, hitting home runs, hitting doubles, running the bases with abandon, making great throws from the outfield. He'd been doing that for years, but now it was being noticed by a national audience and a national television audience. And that's what really raised the level of respect. He had been a superstar for much of the 1960s, but now everybody in the country knew it. And the ironic thing is that he was toward the end of his career. He was 36. He was still an outstanding player, but he was actually not at the peak athletically. And of course, nobody knew that he was only 2 years from dying. He would die just a couple of years later after or less than 2 years later after the 1972 series. So this was late in his career, and yet he still played at a very high level. And for these 7 games, he was incredible. He had 414, he had 2 home runs. He didn't throw anybody out on the bases, but he made some incredible throws. He made one throw to third base that made a play close that shouldn't have been close. And then he made a great throw from the warning track to Manny Sanguillen at the plate on one hop from the warning track. And it was such a strong throw that it discouraged the runner at third base, Mark Belanger, from trying to advance. And he ended up retreating to third base because he saw how good the throw was. So he did everything in those 7 games. I don't want to say that he single-handedly won the series, because Steve Blass pitched well. There were other good performers, but Clemente did as much as any one player could do in carrying his team to victory.
And they didn't beat really, and it wasn't an easy team to beat, the Orioles of 1971. They were pretty stacked, right?
This was one of the great regular season teams in history. I believe they won 108 games. They had 4 20-game winners. They had a lineup that included 2 Hall of Famers, Frank Robinson and Brooks Robinson. They had other great players like Boog Powell, Davey Johnson, Don Buford. Their pitching staff had Jim Palmer, Mike Cuellar, Dave McNally, Pat Dobson. They had a good, though not a spectacular bullpen. They really didn't have any weaknesses. They were a totally dominant team in the regular season and in the playoffs, which they swept in 3 games. And they won the first 2 games against the Pirates, blowout fashion. And the Pirates looked really bad. And it got to a point where there was a headline writer in, I think, one of the Baltimore papers who wrote something like, Orioles will win the series in 3 games. That's kind of a joke. I don't think the Pirates really appreciated that. And even if some Pirate fans were starting to doubt, Clemente was not one of those doubters. He still felt the team could come back. Now, he played exceptionally well in those 2 losses. But the Pirates as a team kind of rose to his level over the next the next 5 games, 4 of which they came away with victories in. So it was very much a David versus Goliath matchup. The Orioles were heavy favorites. And after those first 2 games, it looked like they were unbeatable.
Yeah, it sounds like they were really ready for the World Series. And it's amazing that, Clemente and the Pirates were able to come back and defeat them in that. So it really shows sometimes all you need is some good leadership, right?
And I don't think it's that the Orioles overlooked them or took for granted that they were going to win, because Earl Weaver was their manager. Mm-hmm. And he was not the kind of a manager who would allow that attitude.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. So I think it was just more the Pirates raising their game, mm-hmm. and the Orioles not playing as well as they did in games 1 and games 2. It was one of the great series ever.
Yeah. So I want to switch gears really quickly and chat a little bit about one of Clemente's teammates at this time, Willie Stargell. I know that you have sort of an interesting story about when you were able to spend some time with Willie Stargell and how that helped you to write this book that we're here to talk about today. So if you could just chat a little bit about Willie Stargell and your relationship with him.
Yeah, Lee, what happened was this. It was mid-90s. I had just started working at the Hall of Fame, maybe a year or 2 earlier. And I'd heard that Willie Stargell was going to be coming to town. He was actually brought here by the Postal Service. And he did a talk in our Grandstand Theater in front of some youngsters. I believe they were from the Cooperstown School, if I'm not mistaken. So he addressed the kids. He spoke to them. And then later in the day, I got an invitation from the front office staff here at the Hall of Fame. And they said, hey, would you like to go to lunch with Willie Stargell? We know that you're a fan of Clemente and those Pirate teams of that era. And I said, would I like to go to lunch? Yeah, I'll adjust my schedule. And we ended up going to an Italian restaurant on Main Street that's not there anymore. We had a very nice lunch. And I got to talk to Stargell and ask him some questions. And he told me stories about his relationship with Roberto. He told me one story in particular, how it wasn't just natural talent with Roberto Clemente. He worked at it. He practiced. He used to do something before games that no one really ever saw because they weren't at the ballpark early enough. He would put a garbage can at the third base bag or near the third base bag, and it would be upright. And from right field, Clemente would practice making throws to the garbage can. He would try to throw the ball into the garbage can. And Stargell said, yeah, more than occasionally, he'd be able to put the ball right into the garbage can on a fly, or he'd be able to hit the garbage can on a fly. This was to improve his accuracy of his throws, not necessarily the strength, but the accuracy. So he did things like this that were never seen by fans or maybe even much of the media. And it was a way that he kept himself sharp in terms of practice. So it wasn't just natural talent. Yeah, he did have an incredibly strong throwing arm that most of us humans could never hope to have. But he worked at it. He made himself accurate with those throws, precise. He was a big believer in precision in his game. And you only get that through practice and repetition. So Willie told me stories like that. And, Willie was a great man, too. He, of course, after Clemente died, really took the mantle of leadership on the team. And Stargell himself became the leader of that great 1979 team, the We Are Family team. By then, he was known as Pops. He was really imparting a lot of the wisdom and leadership that he had learned from Roberto Clemente. So that torch was passed from Clemente to Stargell. But the admiration that I heard in Stargell's voice when talking about Roberto Clemente, they were very close friends as well. It was very genuine during that conversation we had at lunch that day.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Would you go as far to say it was Clemente sort of a mentor to Willie Stargell as far as like leadership on a team goes, do you think?
Yeah, I think probably in the early years, Stargell started playing for the Pirates in the early 60s. Clemente had been there a few years. Really, though, it wasn't until the mid-60s when the Pirates brought in more Latino players, more Black players, that Roberto really started to feel more comfortable in the clubhouse and some of his own natural leadership skills started to come around. I think Willie certainly did learn from Clemente in the late 60s. I think by 1971, Stargell had already taken on some of that leadership burden, if you will. They really had three leaders. They had Clemente, who was kind of at the top of the rung, and they had Stargell, and they had Bill Mazeroski, who had been a longtime player, was at the end of his career, but still had a real presence in that clubhouse. They were the three main guys, but I think Clemente was at the top, and then Stargell and Maz, in terms of leadership, were right below. And certainly a lot of the lessons that Stargell learned from Clemente, I think he would apply in the mid-70s, in the late 70s, when he became the guy that everybody looked to in that clubhouse.
Yeah, those are some pretty significant names to have as leaders in your clubhouse. So those Pirate teams were pretty lucky.
Yeah.
So when you had this lunch with Willie Stargell, do you think that inspired you to write the book, or did you already have an idea that you might write a book one day about Roberto Clemente?
I'm trying to remember because it's been a while, but I think I had a notion that I wanted to write a book at that point. And I hadn't started the process of writing it. That really didn't begin until 1998. But I did take some notes, and I didn't record the conversation. We were at lunch and there were other people there, but I did take some notes on what Willie said. And certainly when I started writing the book shortly thereafter, I did incorporate some of Willie's words into the manuscript. So yeah, it wasn't a fully developed book idea at that point, but I think I knew in the back of my mind that at some point I want to write a biography of Roberto Clemente, and that's what I did end up doing in 1998.
And for those of you who are potentially just joining us today, we are interviewing Bruce Markusen, our usual host of these virtual programs, on his book that came out originally in 1998 called Roberto Clemente, the Great One. And it was re-released a few years ago, I know, but Bruce, what was the significance of that 1998 release year? Why 1998?
Well, when I came to the agreement with Sports Publishing, which was the publisher of the book originally, we all wanted to capitalize on the fact that that was the 25th anniversary of his induction. And he was the first Latino player to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. So that was part of the reason why we decided that 1998 was the year. That ended up putting me on a ridiculous schedule as far as getting it written. At the time, I was working in the research department. So what I pretty much did every day at 5 p.m. when I was done with my work shift, I would stay in the library. I'd call down to security and say, I'm staying late again. I'm going to be looking through the stacks, looking through the books, the magazines. And every day I wrote about Clemente, and I was able to get the story done, the book done by probably August or September. And I think we had the book out in time for the fall that year. So that was the initial impetus behind putting the book out in 1998. We wanted to kind of take advantage of that anniversary. And it was actually around that same time that the Hall of Fame did a temporary exhibit. We used to do an exhibit in the library in what is now our Sandlot Kids Clubhouse. And I think we did like 2 a year. Each time the exhibit would go up for like 6 months and then it would be taken down. And it was around that time, I think it was sometime in 1998, that the Hall of Fame did put together the exhibit on Clemente. I didn't really contribute to that. I'm not a curator. I'm just, I was in the research department at the time. But I do remember seeing the exhibit and thinking how exciting that was. And another thing that was really cool about that exhibit, it was actually bilingual. Now, of course, we have Viva Baseball, a permanent exhibit that is bilingual. But this temporary exhibit on Clemente actually predated that. It was up for 6 months. And I would walk by it every day, making my way up the stairs to the library, to the research department. So that was kind of special to be able to see that every day.
Absolutely. I know throughout the years you've had obviously you never met Clemente, but you have had the opportunity to meet a few of Roberto Clemente's family members. I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit about the interactions that you've had with his widow and maybe some of the Clemente children.
Yeah, that photo on the left of Roberto and his wife, Vera, who died just a couple of years ago. It's a great image. It's somewhere in the early 60s. They had been married for just a few years at that point. Vera came here in 2000, and she came here with her middle son, Luis. I'm not sure if that's Luis on the right.
Yeah, I wasn't able to determine which child that was, but it's a great picture.
Yeah, it really is. I think it's either Luis or the eldest son, Roberto Jr. There's a third son, Enrique, whom I've never met. He lives in Puerto Rico, but I have met Luis and Roberto Jr. So Luis and Vera came here in 2000, and I was lucky enough to be invited to have dinner with them. My wife Sue and I went to the Otesaga to have dinner one night with them. What a thrill that was. Vera, just couldn't have been a nicer person. She was just so gracious and humble and took an interest in you. Very kind. She was totally devoted to Roberto, never remarried after his passing. She was just fantastic. And Luis was great too. And to hear their memories, what it was like to live with this, well, we treat him like a superhero, but to them, he was husband and father, and he was great at both of those roles. But to talk to people that lived with him every day and were there and knew the real Roberto, what an experience that was. I mean, that was just amazing.
Absolutely. And another thing that kind of came out of this visit really seems to be this significant change to Roberto Clemente's plaque that happened in 2000. So I'm not sure if everyone is aware. There have only been a few plaques in our gallery that have ever been changed. Typically, it's one of one, but there have been a few instances where there may be an error or some incorrect information that needs to be changed. So for those who are not familiar, around this time in late 2000, Roberto Clemente's plaque was updated from reading Roberto Walker Clemente, Walker being his mother's maiden name, to Roberto Clemente Walker. So Bruce, if you could just speak a little on that and explain maybe some of the reasoning behind that change.
Yeah, this was a common mistake. A lot of reference books, I think maybe even some of the baseball encyclopedias, listed him as Roberto Walker Clemente. That was a common thing. A lot of us assumed that Walker was his middle name. We didn't understand that in Latino culture, and specifically in Puerto Rico, you have two last names. Your first last name is your father's last name. So that was Clemente. You have officially, though, a second last name, your mother's maiden name. So that was Walker. So I imagine whenever he signed a legal document, he would sign it Roberto Clemente Walker. In common everyday use, they dropped the second name. So that's why everybody referred to him as Roberto Clemente. Walker was not his middle name. It was the mother's maiden name. But the Hall of Fame didn't realize this. We made the mistake that a lot of other people made at that time, early 70s. So we had him listed as Roberto Walker Clemente. Vera noticed this during her visit in 2000. I'm not sure if she didn't notice it in 73 when she was here for his induction. Maybe she didn't want to say anything at the time. Maybe it was just I know it was an emotional weekend for her and the family. And with everything going on, maybe it just sort of got overlooked. But when she came here in 2000, she and Luis noticed the incorrect ordering of the name on the plaque. So Vera asked our then president of the Hall of Fame, Dale Petrosky, if the Hall of Fame would change the plaque and correct the name, do it the right way, Roberto Clemente Walker. And without hesitation, Dale did absolutely the right thing and said, yeah, we need to correct this. So at that point, the Hall of Fame put out an order to the Matthews Bronze Company in Pittsburgh, which does the plaques. Coincidentally, it's in Pittsburgh, where, of course, Clemente played. And we ordered a new plaque. I'm not sure how long it took, probably a couple of months, but it was sent out. We put the new plaque with Roberto Clemente Walker in the right order on the wall in the plaque gallery. We took the old plaque, though, instead of putting it into storage, we actually eventually put it in our Sandlot Kids Clubhouse, which is just outside of our offices, our education offices here in the library. And if you walk into the Sandlot Kids Clubhouse and you look to your right, look down, you'll see this little case, and I guess part of it's sort of shown in the photograph on the left, where the original plaque resides, where it says Roberto Walker Clemente. And then next to the plaque is an explanation of what happened with the original plaque, how it was incorrect, how in Latino culture, the mother's maiden name is part of the name that everybody takes. It's their second last name. It's the way that Latino people kind of show respect and reverence for the mother and the mother's side of the family. So that is all explained in this little exhibit in the Sandlot Kids Clubhouse. So at this point, he's the only Hall of Famer who actually has two plaques currently on display, the corrected plaque in the gallery and the original plaque that is in the Sandlot Kids Clubhouse. So it's kind of a neat thing how we've been able to take what was an inaccuracy and teach a little bit, I think, about Latino culture.
Absolutely, yeah, turning an innocent mistake into, a lesson. And I do think I take it for granted that we walk by it every single day when we come into our offices, that we see, can see both of these plaques on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that this sort of ties to is really the legacy of Roberto Clemente. And we've seen that a lot, especially this season in Major League Baseball. Obviously, your book came out a few years ago, so this isn't quite covered, but I think it's really important to talk about the legacy, especially 50 years out from that 3000th hit, and we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of his induction next year. And there were some really significant moments in Major League Baseball this year. We had the Pirates and the Mets playing on Clemente Day at Citi Field. And that same day, we had the Tampa Bay Rays field the first ever all-Latino lineup, and every single member of that lineup was wearing Roberto Clemente's number 21. So just talk a little bit about the legacy of Roberto. The other image here of the man sort of reaching towards Roberto's plaque was a few years ago, his older brother, Justino, visited the Hall of Fame, and that's an image of that was the first time he had been to Cooperstown. So really it just shows the legacy of Clemente is living on through his family, but also through current Major League Baseball players.
Yeah, Leah, there's been some talk in recent years about universally retiring Clemente's number 21 across Major League Baseball, the way they've done for Jackie Robinson. Up until now, Major League Baseball has been hesitant to do that. But on Roberto Clemente Day, which is September 15th, they do allow players, if they want to wear number 21. It gets a little confusing when you're watching the game because everybody from the back has that same number, but it is the way to honor Clemente. A lot of the Latino players on teams other than the Pirates will wear 21 as a regular number because they feel that kinship with Clemente. They grew up with Clemente being kind of a hero to them. But yeah, it's a huge deal. And I can remember years ago when there wasn't a Roberto Clemente Day and nobody really talked about wearing number 21 in his honor. And this really kind of ties up to the point that in some ways his legacy 50 years after his death is more powerful than the way that he was thought of during his playing days. Yeah, people knew he was a great player. They knew he was going to make the Hall of Fame. But after his death, and especially, I would say, last 15 or 20 years, there's been sort of this momentum where he is more popular, more talked about, more discussed by the media, by Latino players, but by other players too. It just seems like he's become a more popular topic of conversation. Maybe it's because of the heroic way that he lost his life. He was killed in a plane crash trying to help out earthquake victims. He was a tremendous humanitarian and did charitable works throughout his life, even long before that effort to try to help out the folks in Nicaragua. But I think the way that he died, losing him so young, so tragically, it has, created this more powerful legacy. I do think, I know it sounds crazy, but I think he's more popular now than he was 50 years ago or 60 years ago.
Do you think that the emphasis on the Clemente Award during the Major League Baseball season, do you think that has anything to do with it?
I think it does, Leah. I think that's an award that a lot of players really cherish. I've heard several players who got that award and maybe other awards like Cy Young Awards, MVP awards. I've heard some of these players say, of all the awards I got, the one that meant the most was the Clemente Award because it honors a player for character, leadership, what a player does for the community. What he does for the team in terms of leadership skills and, being there for the other guys. A lot of players really look at that award and, when they're nominated, each team nominates one player. And I tell you, every player really wants to get that award. Now, there's no rule on how many times you can win it, but the way it's worked out, no one has won it more than once. So it's pretty prestigious. And it's something that the players really, they seem into. They're really in tuned to it. It means a lot for them to get the award. And it's not an award that just goes to Latino players. It goes to white players or African-American players. It goes to the player that really best exemplifies Clemente's character and the kinds of things that he did, especially away from the playing field. So it does have a great significance. And I think it seems more significant today than back in the 70s. It originally was known as the Commissioner's Award. Bowie Kuhn started that award. Bowie Kuhn was the commissioner at the time, and it was a character and leadership award. But he was a big fan of Clemente. He loved Clemente. He was good friends with him. And shortly after Clemente died, it was Bowie Kuhn who decided we need to rename the Commissioner's Award the Roberto Clemente Award. That's where that all started. And once it took on the Clemente name, I think it really took on more prestige. And players to this day really pay a lot of attention to it.
Yeah. When you look at the list of Clemente Award winners, There's a lot of very significant names on that list, and there's a lot of Hall of Famers that have won that award over the years as well. And something that I think is really cool that Major League Baseball recently started doing, if you are an active player that is a Clemente Award winner, you're allowed to, for the entire season, wear a little number 21 patch on the back of your cap to sort of show off the significance of winning that award and really how prestigious and how much it means to so many players.
I didn't realize that about the patch, so I learned something right there.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. That's pretty cool that they do that.
I think this might be the first season that they've done that, so
Yeah.
it'll be cool to see more attention hopefully be on the award and on the what players do off of the field. I think that's just as important as what they do on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to talk a little bit about the picture of Roberto's brother, Justino. He was here, I want to say it was about 5 or 6 years ago. He visited the Hall of Fame. And Adrian Burgos, whom we've had on to talk about Hall of Fame voting, an expert on Latino baseball. Adrian was our translator for a program we did with Justino in the Grandstand Theater because he doesn't speak English. Justino is the last surviving member of the Clemente immediate family. Roberto, as I recall, had 7 brothers and sisters, and Justino is the last one. So we had him come here in, I want to say it was around 2015 or 16. And it was such a thrill to meet him. He'd never been here before, but here's one of Roberto's brothers who knew him really well. And he was the last surviving link of the family that Roberto Clemente grew up with in that small village of Carolina, Puerto Rico.
It's amazing he was able to make it all the way to Cooperstown. I know and people who have visited here before. It's not exactly an easy place to get to, but it is worth the trip if you do decide to make it. I do want to take a second to turn, if anyone has any questions for Bruce on Clemente, on his book, anything that we might be able to add on to this conversation, we're more than happy to take questions. Bruce, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I really think that the story of Clemente is important. It's important to everybody. But I hope that some kids will watch this program at some point because it will go on our YouTube channel. And I hope that kids can take something from the life of Clemente, even though they obviously never saw him play and they were never around when he was around. I mean, it is 50 years ago. But here's a guy that overcame a lot. He overcame bias, prejudice, bigotry, racism. He had many obstacles. He was, trying to get used to a new culture here. He struggled early in his career, but he persevered. He became a star, a superstar. He led his team to a world championship. But even as he became this larger than life figure, he became a baseball celebrity. He never forgot his roots, never forgot that he grew up relatively poor. His family with 7 brothers and sisters, they didn't have a lot of luxuries. They had regular meals and they had clothes to wear. They weren't extremely poor, but they didn't have a lot of luxuries. And Clemente grew up in that kind of very modest background. He never forgot that. And he always remained very sympathetic toward people that came from similar backgrounds, especially kids. He always wanted to help out kids. He would hold free baseball clinics every winter when he went home to Puerto Rico. And he would talk to the kids about how to play the game and do fundamental things, how to catch the ball, how to make throws, how to run the bases. And he didn't charge these kids a dime. I'm sure he signed a lot of autographs and those were always for free. He didn't charge money for that. So he never forgot those roots. He always wanted to help out those who were struggling. And even though by this point in his career, he was making good money, he was living a more comfortable life, he was a superstar. But he always remembered exactly where he came from. And he never allowed his ego to get out of hand. He remained grounded till the end. And I think that's a really important lesson for kids out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bruce, this has been so great. Thank you so much for taking my questions. And I know you're usually the one in my seat interviewing other people. So you've been a great guest today. I just wanted to remind everyone, our very own Bruce Markusen is an author. We've been discussing today his book, Roberto Clemente, the Great One, originally published in 1998 and then reprinted in 2013. It is still available on Amazon if you are interested in learning more about Clemente and reading some of Bruce's writing. It's, I think, a Kindle version and a print version, so be sure to check that out. Thank you so much again, Bruce, for this. This has been great.
Well, thanks, Leah. I really appreciate great questions, and you took it easy on me. You could have really grilled me, but
Hey, we have to share
well.
an office space, so I had to be nice, right?
Great job. Thanks, Leah. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Bruce.
Okay.